This particular tutorial is going to be on the new DBQ, and in many ways, because of the revisions that are taking place this year, it really is the newer DBQ. But like I said before, and I'll keep repeating throughout this time period of this class, the newer DBQ for this year really is not any type of major changes from what we've been doing for the last couple of years. In fact, the revisions that have been made, I think, make our lives easier, and it makes it easier for the students as well. You know, a lot of times when people look at the DBQ, I think students, especially at the beginning of the year, they really see the DBQ as this incredibly difficult essay because there's so many components that go into it. But I think the good news is by the end of the year, the students like the DBQ in comparison to the other writing assignments. And there's a good reason why. The DBQ really, in the end, provides the basic materials the students need in order to do the essay that they're going to do on a particular time period. It's just a matter of getting them into the practice during the year of doing the kinds of historical thinking skills we want them to do. But that's the good news. This entire class now is based off of historical thinking skills. So if you're practicing that regularly with the students, the DBQ is going to be something they can tackle. So here's what I would suggest for the overall structure and to make it somewhat simplified and systematic for the students as far as the DBQ goes. First off, they need to start off with contextualization, which is going to be that big picture that we talked about at the beginning of the class. If you get into the airplane, you're looking out over the horizon. We're talking about the big trends and issues of a time period. Then the thesis, 2 to 3 sentences in which they're going to make a major argument answering the prompt. I would suggest having them write a paragraph that I call the alternate opinion, in which they give an opposing viewpoint with a weighing statement. And I'll explain how to do that. I think there's a huge advantage to doing that. Then I have my students use all of the 7 documents. You will see in the rubric and instructions that they are allowed to miss one of the documents. They'll still get full points. But I always have my students use all 7 documents. I don't want them to get into the habit of thinking that they can miss something. I'd rather have them make that mistake at the end of the year than get into the habit of doing that. Last up, they need to do an analysis. Again, they can do 4 or more documents for the analysis. I require my students to do all 7. The analysis has to be with 3 types of analysis: point of view, audience, or purpose. And then last off, they have to make sure in their paragraphs that they use outside details or historical context. Remember at the beginning of the class we talked about how that's when the airplane lands, it's all the specific events that take place. Now in the past, I used to have one more bullet point here with synthesis, but like I said at the beginning of the course, that has now been taken out of the course. So there is no requirement for that. In the past, I would have them finish their essay, whether it was DBQ or long essay, with a synthesis paragraph. I now have a new way that I'm going to have them finish up. I will be having them do a concluding paragraph, but I think it's actually going to help us with the thesis point, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So in your introductory paragraph, what should it look like? Keep in mind this is only true for the DBQ. Usually for the long essay, what I teach my students is that unlike their English classes, an introductory paragraph should just be a thesis. In the case of the DBQ, I tell my students you've got to have an overall contextualization. This is, I think, a perfect place. They're used to this in their English classes of using about 2 to 3 sentences to set the context for the essay. I tell them to do the same thing here. After their 2 to 3 sentences for context, then they provide a thesis, which has 2 to 3 sentences. And the way I teach it to them is I say, okay, you're going to address all parts of the question. And I always say there are 3 parts to any question they're going to be asked, any prompt. I don't care what it is. It could be short answer, it could be DBQ, it could be long essay. And those 3 parts are the historical thinking skill, so that could be cause and effect, it could be change in continuity over time or comparison and contrast, the historical content that they've got to answer, and then last up, the impact. And this is really important, and this is where I think students tend to miss things, and they tend to lose their points here. They have to look for what is the impact to the specific prompt. And what I like to use is the acronym SPRITE for that one. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. SPRITE is that social, political, religious, ideological, technological, and economic impact. I ask them to find, okay, which part of the SPRITE impact are they asking you to hit? And then make sure you hit all of those within your thesis. So here's an example. You probably remember this. This actually comes from before the major changes that took place in the class, but this was a DBQ from several years ago. Evaluate if the New Deal was effective in solving the Great Depression. Explain how the New Deal changed the role of the federal government in the United States. The first part of this probably we wouldn't see in a DBQ, although it's possible today, but the historical thinking skill is pretty obvious off of this one. It's in the second sentence. Explain how the New Deal changed the role of the federal government. So there we see a cause and effect relationship. So there's our cause and effect historical thinking skill. The content is pretty straightforward about the New Deal. The New Deal both in its effectiveness and the New Deal in how it changed the federal government. And then last up, is the impact, and the impact here is political. So there you go, on the Sprite impact, it's the political part of it, so they need to address that. So here would be, in my mind, a poor example of where they would not get a point. New Deal solved economic problems in the United States. It also changed the government in multiple ways. This led to major changes in the government and society. So the first major problem here is extremely vague. Okay, it solved economic problems. How? What's your reason for making this argument? Changed the government in multiple ways. That pretty much is just a restatement of the prompt. And then last up, this led to major changes in the government and society is sort of a repetition of that second sentence, which is a repetition of the prompt. Here's what I would want my students to do. The New Deal boosted consumer spending during a period of economic decline, and it changed the government from laissez-faire to interventionist. This allowed the government to regulate trade between the states. So notice what's happened here. In this particular good example, we have a clear reason given to us about a change that's taken place in consumer spending. We also see how the federal government has changed its relationship in two different ways, into an interventionist government as well as one that regulates trade between the states. So we have historical thinking skill, we have the political impact, and we have a specific reason for why the change took place. So now here's where I do something. Your students don't have to do this, but this is my suggestion. You might remember at the very beginning of the class I talked about how they kind of threw the APUS history teachers something to compensate for the fact that we moved from dimensional scoring into holistic scoring, which I'll talk about in a future PowerPoint presentation. In the past, APUS history teachers taught through holistic grading, in which we would look at the overall essay and then categorize it according to either a low, high, or medium score. That's been taken away. Now we give specific points for skills. But there was a point that was given for an overall holistic understanding of the essay. And this is in the thesis section, but that's kind of misleading. It's not about the thesis, it's about the overall essay. Is the essay coherent? That's the idea. So here's what I do with my students to make sure they hit this. First of all, I want their entire essay to be coherent. I want to make sure that they provide a good argument. But I tell them that they're going to provide a second introductory paragraph. It's going to be about 2 to 3 sentences in which they give an alternate opinion, restate their thesis, and then weigh the thesis. Okay. Now, why is this a good idea? Well, in my mind, there's a really good potential here. A lot of times students will say, well, out of the 7 documents, one of the documents didn't fit my argument, so I didn't know what to do with it. Okay, here's what you can do. Take that document, find out what's the gist of the document, what's the argument. That becomes your alternate opinion. Now use the document to back it up and then weigh against it and then move into an analysis of your other documents. So not only does this demonstrate to the readers that you can see differing points of view, this gives the kids a chance to be able to include all the documents even if they disagree with each other. So here's an example of doing this alternate opinion. Remember, this would be a second introductory paragraph. Some historians argue that the New Deal was ineffective until World War II and that it violated the constitutional balance between the federal and state governments. However, the New Deal provided more consumer spending, boosting overall GDP during an economic decline. So here we have 2 very specific arguments historians make against the New Deal, but then a restatement of our thesis and a statement about why we still outweigh off of this. Now, if we had a document that backed up that idea that the New Deal was ineffective, this would be a great place to put it, and then go back to our thesis. So after this, we do the body paragraphs, and what I teach my students is that you always want to make sure you start off your body paragraphs with a topic sentence. A lot of times students don't like to do this. They'll jump right into using documents. You want to get them out of the habit of doing that. Make sure that they have a topic sentence and that that topic sentence supports the thesis, uses a historical thinking skill. Next up, I have them do outside details, and for me, the way that I look at it is that it would be a good idea to have 2 outside details per paragraph. Now, here's the good news about this. You only really need to have 1 outside detail in your entire essay in order to get that point for historical context or outside details. But I tell my students, I want them to provide more than that. I want to make sure that they provide a enriched, good essay. I think it's good if they make a mistake, they still get that point. Plus, I think it's just good writing and that they need to be ready for that for college. So I have them frame their documents by having an outside detail at the beginning of the paragraph and at the end of the paragraph. Then I have them use 2 to 3 documents, and I always tell them, no quoting, no paraphrasing. This gets into a little bit of controversy with some teachers. Some teachers do like to have students quote and then do some analysis afterwards. They're not going to get points taken away for doing that, but I think it's just bad habit in APUS to do that. In college, students quote and then they do analysis, that's fine. If you want to have your students do some kind of research paper, they do that, that's fine. But I would suggest for the AP essays, the graders really want to see analysis. So I would just get them out of the habit of quoting or paraphrasing, have them go directly into analysis, and they can do that by using point of view, audience, or purpose. So here are some examples that I would suggest. The way that I do this with my students is I have them cite by author or title and then do their analysis. So a poor example, Franklin Roosevelt argued the New Deal would help the economy because he was providing money for the working class to spend on the economy. Not only is this sort of a repetitive statement, but on top of that, it's pretty straightforward to what a document would say. Here's the analysis we want to give off of that. The document from Roosevelt was a speech promoting his efforts to unite the working class, farmers, and minorities in order to build a coalition for his reelection. Now, how do I know that this is analysis? The word promoting is what tells me this. So that gives me the purpose of what he's after. And that's really what I want my students to get into the habit of doing, is use those kinds of verbs that will force them into doing point of view, audience, or purpose. And in this particular case, it's a good example of how he's doing an action. It's promoting. It's not what he's saying, it's what he's promoting. So outside details. These are specific events, issues, or people from the historical context that help to explain the purpose of the document. We probably remember this from the old days of AP US history. The rule we always gave was it's either not in the document, the outside detail, or it's in the document but not explained. Like I said, I'd like to have them use at least 2 for each paragraph to frame the documents, and students should place them before and after the documents. It's a great way to end the paragraph and transition into the next paragraph. So here's an example. A poor example, Roosevelt created a series of programs in the New Deal, including banking reforms, public works, and old age retirement. It's just kind of vague, and it doesn't really lead into the documents, but here's where I would want the students to do outside details that will lead into the documents. Roosevelt's efforts to public works programs and agricultural reforms in the AAA were intended to unite farmers and workers in building a new political coalition. Notice that those are specific examples. They lead into that promotion idea that will lead me directly into my analysis of the documents about how he was promoting a political coalition. So just a quick review of this, because there are so many components that go into the DBQ. This is what, for me, a body paragraph should look like. Topic sentence, outside detail 1, then you want to do your analysis of document 1, analysis of document 2, and then outside detail number 2. So here's the tough part, right? When we get to the concluding paragraph, and students are so used to doing concluding paragraphs, should we have them do them? Well, in the past, it was a little bit easier. Even though synthesis was tough to teach, at least I could always tell my students, that's the way you should finish up your essay. It worked out really well, but there's not going to be a synthesis anymore. So how are we going to do this? I would strongly suggest having them restate the thesis. Here's why I think it's just such a great idea. It helps them to wrap up the essay. They're used to doing concluding paragraphs, so it's very natural for them to do that. And when the graders look for points, they will always look in the introduction and the conclusion. So let's just say for some reason they don't like the thesis in the introduction. They will then look at the conclusion, state it again. You have a second opportunity then for the students to get that point. So for the rubric, like I said at the beginning of the class, unfortunately, I can't tell you for certain what the rubric's going to look like because we don't know until they come out in August. But here's what we do know from the old rubric, and what I would just say to set up over summer to get used to, because the changes are so minor, I can't believe that the rubrics are going to change all that much. They might change in points a little bit, but I can't believe they're going to change all that much. In the past, the thesis was 2 points, 1 point for the thesis, 1 point for coherency. You have to address 6 of the 7 documents for 1 point. I suggest all the documents for your students. I would not give them the point unless they do that during the year. Analysis of 4 points, 4 documents for a point. Again, I have them do all if they want to get that point. Contextualization is 1 point. That goes at the beginning of the essay. Outside details, 1 point. And again, we used to have another point for synthesis. We don't have that anymore. So I suggest that you have them restate the thesis in the conclusion, and that will help them to get that point for the thesis. So takeaways. Really important. Students must address all parts of the prompt. And remember, what I teach my students is there are 3 parts to every prompt they need to look for. Historical thinking skills, so that would be cause and effect. Change in continuity over time, comparison, contrast. Content, what is it asking you to do? And then impact, that sprite impact. Social, political, religious, ideological, technological, economic. The overall essay is going to be graded for coherency, so that's why I have them do that second introductory paragraph. Documents must be analyzed, not quoted or paraphrased. Get them out of the habit of doing that. And again, there is no longer any synthesis. They are not going to be doing that anymore. I would strongly suggest a restatement of the thesis. Should you do synthesis in your class? Absolutely. Absolutely. Use that as a way to get the students into doing good historical thinking skills. But when they do their write-ups for DBQs and essays, they no longer are doing that. So that's the DBQ. I think once you teach this in that kind of systematic way, you're going to find that your students really like doing the DBQ.